Throughout human history, trees have held a central place in many cultures across the world. Trees can be symbols of eternal life, for example, evergreens that never fade, and others are used to represent cyclical rebirth when leaves are shed in autumn, to reveal a tree that looks all but dead and then grows anew each spring. But amongst these general motifs about trees, there is one motif that seems to be known more than most, that occurs across many of the world's continents, and that is the world tree, sometimes considered the axis mundi, the centre of the world where the earth and the heavens meet. This seems like an ancient belief, so how old is this? Where does this idea come from? My name is John White. I'm a specialist in Indo-European mythology, and I curate the Mythology and Folklore database, which is a data source that is used by scholars and universities around the world in the research of myth and folklore and social sciences. And today I will explore the origins and development and evolution of this world tree motif. I'll explain where it comes from, its varied purpose across many of the world's cultures, and why we think of it as we do. And so, if that sounds interesting to you and you want to understand, in effect, this tree that stands alone in the centre of the world, that binds the cosmos together, reflecting life and death, then grab yourself a cup of tea and welcome to Krakenford. The world tree is often referred to as the axis mundi, a central point on the world's axis, and this motif of a central place is not unique to a tree. It is also known as imago mundi or omphalos, meaning the navel of the world, and can be associated with pillars, mountains and other vertical structures. And this makes sense, as a tree is sometimes perceived as a pillar in the centre of the world, a pillar that holds up the sky away from the ground, touching the heavens, and the heavens that could be accessed from its uppermost branches where spirits can often be found living. Its trunk runs through the human realm, the earthly realm, and there we see it, and through it we can understand time, which is etched as rings within that trunk. And then there are its roots going deep into the underground, but which also pulls the earth together, keeping it stable, touching the underworld and figures that lurk within. The magic of the tree is because of its size and because it touches these three realms with its whole. It's a reflection of the order of the world and of the cosmos, and this image of the tree is well known and found across the whole world in various stories. But it is essential to note that it's not ubiquitous. It is not found in most cultures, despite how well known it is and despite how widespread it is. And this is probably because the dominance of the motif within European culture, reflecting a confirmation bias in many researchers' work. Saying that, we do find it stories of cosmic trees, from the Arctic Circle to the Amazon rainforest, and from the ancient cities in Mesopotamia to the plains of the Indo-European homeland. But it is not everywhere, which suggests the motif, may not be as old as we think. Perhaps the most well-known version of this tree comes in the form of Yggdrasil, the mighty ash tree of the Old Norse mythology, the stories that the Vikings would tell. It is said that its branches spread out over the whole world and reach up over heaven, and it connects the 9 realms of the Old Norse myths together. And then, perhaps coincidentally, we find something similar in the Mayan culture of Mesoamerica, who revered the saber or Yaxche tree, which was the conduit between the cosmic levels, and it allowed people to talk to their ancestors. We also find a celestial tree which figures in the myths of the Seneca tribe, who are First Nation Americans located in New York State. Their celestial tree is so tall that not one of the beings could see its top. On its branches, flowers and fruit hung all year round. The beings who lived on the island used to come to this tree and eat the fruit and smell the sweet perfume of the flowers. Later the tree is pulled up and the Sky Mother falls through the hole in the sky to the earth. And she has two twins, dark and light, and as there is yet no sun in their myths, the light twin creates a tree of light, a great tree having at its topmost branch, a great ball of light, which brings forth flowers from every branch. And from this we can see that it is a significant part of their cosmology. In the Arab-speaking world, myths tell of how stars were thought to be the fruits of this world tree. The Assyrians depicted a tree of life as the date tree, or that is our academic interpretation, as it's a little ambiguous. But if it is, then since they artificially pollinated their date trees to produce a greater amount of fruit, the trees could also be seen as a symbol of conception, of birth. And this leads some people to think that a tree may be similar to that of the tree of life or the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden found in biblical stories. These two biblical trees are mentioned in Genesis, and out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We also see the tree take on a role of salvation or sanctuary, with this tree appearing in mythology as a place of refuge. This is most evident in myths about the Great Flood or the Great Deluge, and this is found in India and First Nation American traditions, including Paiute, Seneca and Cree, as well as in Korean sources. In these narratives, humanity survives the flood by clinging to a floating tree or sheltering inside a hollow trunk. Here, the tree is seen as a vessel of salvation. And this probably isn't a transition from a cosmogonic function to salvation, but possibly more to do with a transformation of the earth diver motif, which evolves into the bird scout motif we see in stories such as Noah's Ark, to a story where people climb trees to drop fruit to create land. There are many creation myths about water, and to see a tree in water suggests that the motifs may come from that. And I have many videos on flood mythology. One particular I'll show here, and it tells of the origins of the flood myth. And in a similar vein, we do find tree as a motif in which animals or people do climb to escape danger or from pursuers. And such stories are found in China and the Americas, Japan and Africa. And again, I feel this is not an evolution of the world tree, but a more practical folk tale about using trees in specific situations. So we have to be clear on not all stories of trees are about the world tree in mythology. The motif of a tree is useful in survival, but it becomes particularly important as the cosmogonic function. And what is interesting is that we do find this motif of a tree consistently across cultures, which are separated by oceans and language and thousands, if not tens of thousands of years of history. So did these stories originate and migrate along with humans across the world? Is there a single origin of this, or is it more of a common psychological archetype or a shared cultural memory where the world tree appears as a testament to human desire to connect with the earth, to bind the cosmos? For me, the best place to start is understanding why the world tree is such an important motif. And to do this, we should try and find an early version of a myth that has it with this tree. And we do have such a story, more of a construction I've put together from various stories, but I found this the best way to join ancient motifs together in a coherent manner. And it combines two old myths of creation. And they start in a world where there is no land, only sea, and on it swims a bird. And this is called the earth diver motif. And the bird dives down under the sea and swims to the sea floor. There it grabs in its bill some mud and brings it to the surface. And there on the surface the mud floats and becomes a small island. And the island grows and gets larger and larger and that causes the sea to create waves, and the waves cause wind to blow, and this in turn causes the island to grow a tree in the middle of it. And this tree grows until eventually it pushes the sky away from the sea and from the land, and allowing the next wave of creation to happen. As the sky is pushed up, it allows night to form between the days, and as the cosmos gives its energy to the island, something magical happens. Life appears from under stones, from holes in the ground. Plants and creatures come, and the island continues to grow, and this growing island shakes. But the tree grows taller and stronger. Its roots hold the island together to keep it in place between the sea and the land and the heavens. And then, from the base of the tree, a hole appears, and out of this hole climbs humans. And this is how humans came to be, how land came to be, and how the tree pushed the heavens away from the land and kept the land stable as it grew. Now, this tree growing and humans coming from it is called humans come from the underground or the underworld, and it can be found in the bearskin motifs within the mythology and folklore database. Now, this myth is, or motif is an example of a creation myth that we believe was being told in Asia probably over 30,000 years ago. And there are parts of it we think, such as this tree, which are much older. But the motif of the tree pushing the sky is being told before humans go to the Americas, which happened at the last glacial maximum, an event between 22 and 14,000 years ago. So parts of the story, after knowing land is created by this bird, or sometimes an egg or a hill emerging, are important, for they represent a growing and unstable land, and perhaps that idea was chosen as to explain why earthquakes happened, maybe. And so we see this motif in Siberia before the migration to America, which is interesting in terms of dating these motifs. Now, this unstable land allowed the tree to be seen as a way of holding the land together and as a way of holding up the sky, but also as a conduit in which humans came to the earth. And so its purpose is threefold in terms of cosmogony. And if this is being told in Siberia before the glacial maximum, this offers an opportunity for humans to take these stories with them to the Americas. So, what are the chances of this being the case? And one way to answer this is to understand exactly how common the tree motif is. Now, this is a different approach to how we would usually look at these things. Usually we'd compare different myths, different narratives, break them down into myth themes and compare where the myth themes are and which are the same, which are different, which could have evolved, depending on how we see cultural and linguistic and archaeological changes in the landscape. But there just aren't the myths out there with a world tree in it that contain that. The world tree is part of the cosmology, but isn't necessarily a strong part of many stories in a way that allows us to do that. So we really have to look at how the tree is seen rather than the narratives. So what we see in these stories, in many of these sort of original stories, is the tree is there to support and stabilise the land and to push up the sky. As myths develop, the tree ends up supporting the Milky Way, or to stop the stars from falling, or even creating the stars. And this tree eventually evolves into the pillars we see, let's say, in the Huaynazi myth of the Chinese, and occasionally into a world mountain, such as in Vedic mythology with Mount Meru, as described in the Mahabharata. We can, clearly see in the mythological record how the motif evolves with time as humans ask more and more questions about the world around them and responding to the landscape in which they live. But whilst we see in these myths the tree providing a vertical structure to connect the heavens to the earth, a structure which holds these together, maintaining order, the tree can also be seen as representing a cosmological centre where the realms of life, or the night sky, with the underworld, meet together, a place where life can emerge and die. And so the tree brings together this representation of a place where life and death and renewal within the order of the cosmos can be understood. And so this symbology influences many stories, and those stories that have adapted in society and landscape, which means that the stories of the world tree do vary tremendously around the world, which is why we have this narrative issue. But as I say, there are these regular motifs, and another one is that the tree can grow fruit, often a divine fruit, and that the vertical axis of the tree is seen as connecting worlds. And this aspect of the world tree motif is very common, again suggesting a story that could be continued or a consistent interpretation of a tree, which would be considered an archetypal view. Now, whilst we have an early myth with early motifs, like all prehistoric mythology, we must approach its earliest construction with caution because, let's be clear, not only do we lack narratives, well, there is no direct evidence from the Paleolithic world, no drawings of trees, nothing tangible, no models, no carvings, nothing. However, there are hints of this story. Many of the reconstructed hunter-gatherer cosmologies conceive the world in layers, a sky realm for the gods or ancestors, an earthly realm, and an underworld for the undead. We still find this in myths of the Inuit, the First Nation Australians, the sons of southern Africa, and tribes in Siberia. And also in the First Nation Americans, this vertical cosmology could be considered almost universal. As to not see it in early societies seems to be an exception rather than the norm. In effect, those cultures that did have the myth seem to have similarities in that myth, but not all cultures had the myth. It's a bit of a puzzle. So let's see what tangible evidence does exist for this world tree. Now, the first tangible evidence we see, or at least could possibly interpret as a tree, comes post-glacial maximum, so somewhere between 20 and 14,000 years ago. And the source of this is mainly from the Romanian philosopher Mircea Eliade, who wrote a book about shamanism, where he brings together information from Russian and European ethnographers to show that climbing rituals were a reenactment of the soul leaving the shaman's body and ascending the axis mundi to reach the gods. Now, he's taken this from various narratives he has heard, but we actually see ritual evidence in notched trees or poles in Siberia, and this is reasonably well attested to. This isn't just some fictional phenomenology. This has also some similarity with evidence we see in the Americas, but the evidence isn't quite as clear. There is pole climbing and spiritology in First Nation culture, of the Americans, suggesting that the soul is journeying upwards, and there are some famous folktales about the Sky Woman, suggesting a way to ascend. And that isn't to say that the American and Eurasian cultural traditions are directly linked, but there are similarities. And there are also some very similar attestations to these in South America, in Chile, where a notched pole, which is strikingly similar to the Siberian versions, is used to imitate climbing into the sky and talking to the spirits. In terms of imagery and shamanism, I've made a video explaining the issues here. It's very easy to apply the narrative of the world tree on certain imagery and make assumptions, and also to look at imagery and say it's shamanism and make assumptions, when in fact those images are at best ambiguous. We don't actually know what those images truly represent, or whether they represent world trees or forms of shamanism. And it isn't until we start seeing sedentary behaviour that more evidence emerges that feels more concrete to this belief. Now, if we move the clock forward a few thousand years, we come to what is probably the most famous of the early sedentary sites, Göbekli Tepe. And whilst I have seen all sorts of self-proclaimed experts state all sorts of meanings for the T-pillars that stand within the main buildings, the fact is that there is no evidence of linking them to trees, or even to the primordial twins of creation, for those who do that, as an aside note. However, the fact humans built this place a home, as there are many houses there if you're not aware, then what we could have here is a cosmogonic centre, a centre that could be applied in a world tree view, or indeed the idea of a world tree implanted in the basis of a centre of a sedentary society. But let's be clear, that is still stretching the art of the possible. It really isn't until much later, till probably the 5th millennium BCE, just about 7,000 years ago, that we start seeing the use of tree symbols and palm trees, fruit on trees, on pottery, on seals, and in architecture around Anatolia and Mesopotamia and the Near East to start doing this as well. And this is probably much as a response to agriculture as opposed to serving a cosmogonic representation. And it isn't until the 3rd millennium BCE in Mesopotamia that this symbolism, of a tree becomes really clear to us and reasonably frequent. But this is only in one place in the world. The rest of the world still has to catch up on this imagery. And one could even argue here that the tree we see isn't so much of an axis mundi than it is a cosmic symbol, a source of food and plenty. Now, for those who understand the cultural development of Mesopotamia and the Near East and wonder about the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, which we see in the biblical story of Genesis, they may ask the question, well, are these trees part of the world tree? And I mentioned that earlier, but yes, they inherit some of the properties of the Mesopotamian tree, but they're also quite different. These aren't primitive representations of the world tree. They are carefully reworked motifs from the earlier Mesopotamian mythic motifs. The cosmic function of the tree is retained in relation to life, wisdom, and the boundary of the cosmos, but the tree's influence has been sort of reduced to that of controlling humans, controlling people, not controlling the cosmos, because that was the role of God. It controls morals and knowledge and the life of a person rather than, well, the aspects of the universe. We see in later Jewish traditions an explicit cosmic tree structure, the Kabbalistic tree. This tree, sometimes depicted as inverted, it shows that in the material world there is a dependency upon a higher divine source, and this inversion helps enforce the philosophical claim of causality and emanation rather than spatial accuracy, that the divine rule the physical world. We find in Egyptian religion that the tree doesn't centre in the cosmology, not at a single point, and so there is not a world tree as such, but we do see trees repeatedly appearing. The Eliade tree is probably the most well known, and upon which the name of the kings are inscribed, and so it functions as like a guarantor of legitimate rule. If the king's name is upon this tree, then they are considered a legitimate ruler of Egypt. And then there is also the sacred sycamore tree associated with Nut, which provides nourishment to the dead, which bridges sort of the earthly world of mortality and those in death and eternity. This tree doesn't hold the cosmos together, but it does sustain the cosmos, allowing renewal. Elsewhere in India, we find in the Katha Upanishad, the universe is described as an inverted tree, the Asvatha tree, with its roots extending downwards into the material world. And this inversion is interpreted as doctrinal. The power and energy comes from the heavens down. And we see Buddhism transform this idea with the Bodhi tree, under which Siddhartha Gautama attains enlightenment. And we see images of trees with this figure underneath still today. This tree, like the others, is not an axis mundi, but a similar role in terms of connecting cosmic energy to the earthly world. But Iranian cosmology has two significant trees, the Gao-Karena, which is an eschatological view as it stands in the middle of the cosmic sea and is about renewal of the cosmos, and then there is a tree that contains all the seeds of everything to give life and rebirth to that cosmos. But in terms of climbing and spiritual and connecting to heaven, the ladder figure, so to speak, we have to look at Turkey and Siberia, Mongolia, where we see a ladder being used by shamans when they're in their trance-like state to reach the heavens and the spirits. And here the tree takes on a role more akin to a world tree that many of us think of, with its roots extending to the underworld and its trunk occupies the earthly realm and its branches support the heavens. And in many stories we see birds perch at its summit, spirits dwell within the trunk and along the branches, and ancestors and monstrous beings lurk within the roots. This description also aligns to perhaps the most fully articulated version of the tree, that of the Old Norse Sigdalsil, a tree that binds the 9 world realms together, not worlds, realms. There's a clear distinction there. The Vikings did not believe in different worlds, just different regions. And it's a tree that supports the cosmos, but it is said to be rotting, serpents entwined within its roots gnawing away, and so it predicts the end of the cosmos and the coming of Ragnarok. So this tree is a bit of an ambiguity, that it holds the cosmos together, and whilst holding the cosmos together, really maintaining order, its order is never secured because chaos is within it already. In Germanic Europe, the Irminsul functions as the cosmic tree. It really is a tree that has a ritual centered around groves within it, marking a divine sacred space with trees. And this sacred groves can be seen as really a point of intersection between the earthly realm, mortal realm, and that of the sacred. But perhaps the most interesting place to understand about the world tree and its appearance is the Americas, as this may, as I say, provide some clues off to the origin and age of the tree. The Maya, the Mesoamericans, have the saber tree, and its roots descend to the underworld. Its trunk represents the human realm, and its branches spread into the heavens, similar to the Yggdrasil of the Old Norse. But their cosmogony has 4 additional world trees which represent the cardinal directions, north, south, east and west, giving a physical structure to the world. And in North America, among the First Nation Americans, we have a tree that represents the centre of the earth tree, seen amongst the Ojibwe, the Caddoan and the sun dance pole of the Lakota ritual. But it really is in South America that the South American motifs of this tree look most similar to the European trees. And is that a coincidence? All these motifs of a tree around the world seem similar, but they also have differences to suggest that they do not all stem from the same origin. While South American and Northwestern European properties of the world tree look very similar indeed, so do some of the details between North American and Siberian. It is not impossible that there were multiple migrations taking different versions of the tree to the Americas, and if the origin of that distribution centered around Asia or particularly Siberia, then that could be the case. But it is an unusual dispersal pattern when compared to others we know of. What seems more likely, and is more consistent with what we're seeing, is that the tree is seen as a tall vertical structure that can reach to the heavens and descend to the underworld. This is ubiquitous in most myths because just about everywhere has trees and they all do the same thing. They grow tall and have roots. It is a common understanding of what trees are. You don't have to pass on a story about that. And then combine that with a view of the cosmos being in 3 tiers, which I think is probably a more consistent and original motif that persisted and travelled, and those 3 tiers being the heavens, the earth and the underworld, then this tree and the world tree seems like a result of natural human thinking of putting things together. It is a primitive motif, not just in age, but in thought of how people think about things. The similarities between the details about the tree's functions when it's found, particularly in localised narratives, can be explained through cultural transmission, driven by trade or war or natural human migrations. But generally, it is because trees are trees. We find scholars such as Witzel, in his book The World's Oldest Mythologies, propose a Eurasian framework of myths for the world tree, and so setting a date of around 20,000 years ago at its latest, but an earliest date of probably 40,000 years ago. And that could be true, but due to the lack of shared mythemes and the evidence I've shown you, and that is outside the properties usually associated with a tree, such as they're vertical and old and they act like centre of ecosystems, they provide food and shelter and tools and can be landmarks, and outside of those standard natural thoughts that do not need to be passed on in myth because they're obvious, there really is little evidence to give us confidence that this is absolutely the case. The world tree is an enduring motif because trees are commonplace. They are around us today. They are a significant resource and presence in human life. But they are also old and large and full of life. And across cultures, across millennia, across vast geographic distances, people have returned to the same fundamental image, a great living axis that connects the heavens above and the earth in the middle and the realms below. In this sense, the world tree is not merely a mythological motif, it is a cognitive archetype. What is most surprising to many will be the fact that the world tree does not look to be confined to a single point of origin. Yes, some traditions, especially in Eurasia, clearly share ancient connections through Indo-European, Near Eastern or Central Asian transmission. Other regions, such as the Americas, show strong signs of independent innovation, influenced from the landscape and society, but perhaps with a whisper of Siberian influence. And yet, these independent stories, the resulting cosmologies, often resemble one another, and closely. But this is not evidence of a single ancestor myth, but rather a shared human belief. A shared belief of what trees are, how big they are, and how they connect the world in a tangible sense when coupled with a underlying belief of the heaven, the earth, and the underworld as 3 levels of realm. This really all comes together to create a symbol that is shared in ways of perceiving the natural world, the shared struggles in the cosmos. How could things be brought together and held together? Each tradition will reshape the world tree to meet its own theological needs, yet the structure of the tree remains constant, and this is why the world tree is significant and matters, and why it looks on the surface to be an old myth that has spread across the world. It is not simply a mythic artifact, it is a window into the shared architecture of human thought and the societies they created, how they conceptualized the cosmos, how they understood their place within it, and how they sought connection with forces that they thought were part of the cosmos. Think of a world before maps, before astronomy, before philosophy, and then picture a large tree as an analogy of the cosmos, whilst holding the cosmos together. That is why the world tree endures, because at its heart, it is the story of connection between the realms, between humanity and to the cosmos itself.